Order, order. I would like to start this session by the International Development Committee on our next inquiry, which is the UK government's work on achieving SDG2, which is zero hunger. We're focusing on both sort of nutrition, but also what we need in place to tackle climate change, which is leading to chronic food shortages across the globe. We're very lucky to have two panels. The first panel is Rory Stewart and Dr. Puri, and if I could ask both of you to introduce yourselves and just tell us in your introductions a little bit about your organisation and how it contributes to food security. Dr. Puri, could I ask you first?
Thank you very much, Chair, for having me and IFAD. And IFAD is the institution that I am coming from, which is the International Fund for Agricultural Development, which is both an international financing institution, which means we give loans to developing countries and low-income countries and low-middle-income countries. And we are also a UN organization. And why that's important is that as a UN organization, we focus on leaving no one behind. The big thing that we do is focus on resilience, and I'm hoping that we'll get to speak about that.
So too. Rory, lovely to have you here.
Thank you. My name is Rory Stewart. I've worked in a range of different development contexts, particularly Indonesia, Iraq, Afghanistan. I was a minister in the Department for International Development and finally the Secretary of State for International Development. And I'm now the senior advisor for an organization called Give Directly. Give Directly is a non-profit which focuses on direct cash transfers to the extreme poor and operates in 15 countries, has a budget of about $200 million a year, about 800 staff, and has really been the pioneer not just in cash delivery but also in a lot of the research around the impact of cash.
Thank you very much. Dr. Puri, could I start with you? I wonder if you could give us your thoughts on the FCDO's current strategy. How effective is it in improving food security and supporting sustainable agriculture?
So the white paper is, I think what you're referring to, has been actually quite comprehensive in laying out quite important elements. And I think the key elements that really stood out for IFAD have been the big focus on resilience, also the big focus on ensuring that we're coming in the medium and the long term, but also working with the MDB structures, looking at the evolution of the MDB structures, as well as looking at how we can think about markets. I think overall, the white paper is quite comprehensive. There are a few things that I would focus on, especially because of the vantage point that I'm coming from. One is the big focus on resilience. I think one of the key things that we forget, because humanitarian emergencies are so urgent, is the fact that when we invest in medium and long-term areas, we end up almost, the analogy is prevention and cure. We end up saving a lot of humanitarian dollars. So for every $1 that you invest in resilience, and that's a really system-wide effort, we end up saving anything from $2 to $10 in humanitarian assistance. So that's really important. I think the second part of this is really taking a systems approach. So and I know Rory is going to talk about cash, we didn't align our messages, but I think the key thing is recognizing, especially again, we work with developing countries. Most developing countries don't want to borrow for cash transfers. Because we do a lot of lending, it becomes really important to think about how we can sustain a lot of those resilience structures in terms of systems. So we focus on building and creating and catalyzing new markets. And that means a lot of the infrastructure investments, a lot of investments in assets, a lot of investments in training, in livelihoods, as well as in financial inclusion. And community-based interventions become really important. So the other thing that I think the white paper lays out very nicely is also the focus on localization. IFAD has focused in the past more than 30 years on really doing context-driven and localized development. And we found through our impact assessment, so a lot of the evidence in the evaluations that we do using counterfactuals, that's been enormously successful in achieving resilience, market access, agricultural productivity, as well as overall food security indicators and outcomes. And we can show that with counterfactuals and good econometric analysis as well.
So the white paper, until it's implemented, is just a vision document. Looking back over the last sort of 4 or 5 years, do you think the UK has been focusing enough on prevention, on looking at what's driving food scarcity? Has it done enough to date?
The Chair, I think the key thing is, and this is not just the UK, I think the international community hasn't focused sufficiently, for example, on adaptation. The paper lays this out, and I think overall the international community has recognized it, but if you look at the skew in terms of the overall resources that are coming into food systems, we know that there's a huge gap there. A large part of that is primarily, so even though you have new and additional climate financing coming in, more than $630 billion at last count, the skew is mostly in favor of mitigation. Agri-food systems contribute to approximately 1/3 of the overall greenhouse gas emissions that we are witnessing. But we know that you can do a lot more in terms of reducing food waste and loss. That's a low-hanging fruit. We're not doing enough as an international community in that space. And we're not doing sufficiently in terms of increasing the resilience of agri-food systems. And climate finance can do a lot. It's not currently. And that's because mostly we're concerned about very different indicators within the international lending system and the overall international system. The KPIs, so to speak, in that system are very much skewed towards leveraging, which we know comes from market, but we can't do that with adaptation financing.
Rory, you are in a very privileged position because you've been on both the inside and now the outside. So I wonder, with that sort of eagle view that you've got, are you seeing enough vision from the white paper around transforming food systems, agriculture, but also in the last 4 years, has the government's eye been on this ball?
Well, I think there's try to sort of take them as two separate things. So, and come on to the white paper a bit later. I mean, the fundamental problem, of course, which is not a surprise to any of you, is that the UK is spending much less money than it was. And that's a little bit concealed from the public because of this apparent shift from 0.7 to 0.5, but in reality, what you're seeing in many of our bilateral programs, in many countries in sub-Saharan Africa, is a kind of staggering change. I mean, I'm seeing programs which, when I was the Africa Minister and later when I was Secretary of State, countries where we were spending 80, 90 million pounds a year, we're now spending 10, 12. And by the time you're down at that, we're in situations where, I run a relatively small non-profit. In some countries in Africa, our programs are now larger than the programs of the UK government. It's a very, very big change to suddenly find that we're going in and that we're bigger than the UK government.
And the argument that we keep on getting is where we step back, others stepped in. Are you seeing that on the ground?
I mean, as you're aware, Chair, the reality is that Germany has cut its development assistance. France is cutting its development assistance. The United States has been carrying a lot of the burden, particularly around humanitarian assistance, 85-90% of many of these programs, particularly in the Horn and East Africa. But the political pressures are moving against that in the US as well. It's a very, very challenging environment, and some very dedicated civil servants, and I think some well-meaning ministers. I think Andrew Mitchell's committed to what he's doing, have tried with the white paper to make the best of what I'm afraid is a pretty bad job, and I think that morale is not good because there's a lot of confusion about what the priority of the department is. When I was in DFID, it was very, very clear that this was a department that was about addressing poverty. It's now getting much more muggy. people are talking about middle-income country investment, trade not aid, different forms of rights investments. It's more and more difficult to make an argument around poverty. And unfortunately, it's also more and more difficult to make an argument around evidence. So DFID had a huge research and evidence arm. I mean, enormous. We were spending, I guess, well over £1 billion a year on research and evidence. And DFID has gone in 5 years from being one of the most almost academic and theoretical of all international development organizations. I mean, as a minister, DFID was frequently quite frustrating because it was so driven by economists, scientists, evidence, that it was quite difficult to shift the boat at all. Now to a system where a lot of that seems to have been cast aside. Now, what's the white paper? The white paper is full of very, very promising statements. I was there at the launch of it. I think a lot of charities embrace it and are happy with the language in it. I think the people that wrote it in DFID have produced a good summary of where we would hope to be. But both the Conservative Party and the Labour Party seem to be committed to restoring international development spend when the fiscal situation allows. We've just been through 2 fiscal events, an autumn statement and a budget, where apparently we had headroom, and yet that headroom was not used. Nor do I have much confidence, I'm afraid, that an incoming Labour government is going to use it either to actually get back up to the 0.7%. I think the whole thing is a fraud. They've dropped down to 0.5, and I don't think... it's difficult for me now to imagine what fiscal event would encourage them to return to 0.7.
And the arguments you're making, the committee's just received the OECD mid-term review into the UK, and it's saying the exact same thing. Basically, the reporting has dropped dramatically, and the ODA money now being spent by the Home Office and Treasury is considerably more than it has been, I think, at any time. So, but what you're arguing is sort of around the political choices that have been made. Could you tell us a little bit about the impact on the ground of those choices?
Well, so I mean, again, this is maybe more for the public than the committee, because you know all this stuff backwards, but in broad terms, I think the British public is not being told what's hidden inside the 0.5. The reality is we had made a lot of commitments to these big multilateral organizations, the World Bank, the IMF and others. And some good things, Gavi, vaccine work. We then started putting a lot of money into looking after refugees in the United Kingdom. A good thing to do, again. But the result of that is that of the 0.5, there was much, much less available to go into traditional development programs in sub-Saharan Africa. So one way of illustrating it for the public is, when I was the Africa Minister, I had a bilateral budget for Africa of £4.2 billion a year. And the multilateral money going into Africa was probably another 2 or 3 billion. Right? It's impossible to get honest, clear figures at the moment. But if I add up the amount that I hear when I visit our different embassies around the world and try to package that together, I would imagine the total amount we're spending on traditional non-humanitarian bilateral programs has dropped from 3-4 billion down to a few hundreds of millions. Right? It's probably a real term cut in many of these countries of 60-70%.
And again, I think it's easy to get seduced by the figures, which a lot of people switch off on. So of the budget that you used to have, the bilateral budget, that was probably going to the places that most people assume our aid is going to.
Yes.
So,
So there are many, many different problems, aren't there?
Schools.
Yeah, many different problems. I mean, one is that the aid budget might be paying for hotel bills in the United Kingdom, right, which is just less money, people abroad. In some cases, it will be the money is going into lower middle income countries rather than the extreme poor. Some of that is climate money, and one of the problems with climate money, and this is something Dr. Puri was pointing to, is that if you're focused on trying to stop carbon emissions, your money tends to go to middle income countries that are emitting most carbon. Right? Somalia is right at the receiving end of climate change, but it's not emitting much carbon. So if you're putting most of your money into mitigation, it tends to go to places like Indonesia. Right? But I think, again, as you say, the public may switch off with figures, but one very direct way of saying it is that in some of these countries, we now, have bilateral budgets, £6-7 million a year. Now, I think anyone in Britain understands that over a year, that is a very small amount of money, even in a very poor country. You can no longer pretend that for that kind of money, you are making a significant difference in the development trajectory of that country. And then finally, I suppose, I would say, but I think with less money, this is the time for FCDO to be much bolder about cash, because cash is very effective, very efficient, very transparent. And when you're short of cash, using direct cash is a very good way of getting results.
What you've observed in the last 4 or 5 years, is the UK government closer or further away from achieving SDG2, zero hunger?
The UK government is further away from achieving SDG2, zero hunger. The UK government is further away from being a major driver of any of the Sustainable Development Goals. And that's simply because the UK government is a much less significant player in the international development space.
Sad to hear. Nigel?
Can you just maybe talk us through cash transfers? You were just mentioning that their attributes, I think the FCDO has used them, I think, quite innovatively in humanitarian crisis response, but doesn't probably share your enthusiasm for them in long-term development approaches. Maybe just talk us through why you don't think the FCDO are on the same page as you in this.
Yeah, so you're completely right. FCDO has used it in humanitarian. I think most people get the argument in humanitarian, which is that if you've been hit by an earthquake in northern Syria or southern Turkey, the cash allows you to decide whether you need a tent or food, and allows you to do it flexibly and allows you to build up local markets instead of importing. What is more radical is that there is very strong evidence from randomized control trials, so the exact equivalent of a medical trial, in which you have a control group and a treatment group. So it could be 10,000 recipients not receiving cash, 10,000 recipients receiving cash, randomly selected, so you can really compare. And that's something that is very rarely done in international development, right? Generally in international development, we tell ourselves nice stories. We say, I gave money to this village, and 10 years later, a woman from this village went to university. And we don't really ask ourselves, are we sure, that it was my contribution that led to that outcome as opposed to 100 other things? But randomized controlled trials really allow you to have a scientific treatment group, and you can be pretty confident if you look over 12 years in Uganda at individuals that receive $350 and individuals who receive nothing. If you've got a big enough sample group, you can be pretty confident when you say, on average, the cash increased their savings by 35%, right? And we also run benchmark studies. So benchmark studies against nutrition, that's something that's very relevant to what we're talking about today, which is hunger. Benchmark studies against nutrition in Rwanda suggest that cash is outperforming a traditional nutrition program on nutrition. It's very counterintuitive, but the explanation seems to be that we have in the past had a slightly patronizing attitude to development, and we've imagined that what people are fundamentally lacking is knowledge, whereas in fact what they're generally lacking is cash. So to give a couple of examples related to today, in nutrition, we traditionally would spend an enormous amount of money on people going to teach people what to eat. So you might send out community health workers or nurses to tell people to have more calcium in their diet. Give them the cash, right? And the benchmark, you're literally giving the same amount of cash as you're spending on the training. They buy a cow and they have some milk. And then you actually find that they are, on the key nutritional indicators, improving, right? So 32% increase in consumption, 12% increase in dietary diversity after 1.5 years, with impacts on child height and weight. after 1.5 years, the nutrition intervention compared against a random sample, no impact. Another example might be in agriculture, right? You can have programs in which you can, and I've seen this in Rwanda, you will go into a community and they will say, oh, we've received some terrific training on what seeds to plant, what fertilizers to plant, what to do, and you say, well, that's great, are you doing it? And they say, no, because we've not been given any money to buy any seeds or fertilizers, right? So our basic discovery, confirmed by the evidence, is that generally speaking, poor people have a pretty good idea what their priorities are, what their needs are, and can usually fix those things much more cheaply than an outsider can. So, I know I am talking too much, but I'll just finish with one example. If you trying to address poverty in the round in a village, and you commissioned a non-profit to go into a village of 100 houses, and you said, what we want you to do is fix the housing, make sure everybody who hasn't got a latrine gets a latrine, make sure all the children go to school, make sure people are eating 2 meals a day, make sure people are getting vaccinated, they're getting healthcare. You would spend an absolute fortune because you would send in engineers to survey every house, you would procure the metal roofs, you would send in educational enrollment programs, you'd send in nutrition programs, send all this. You'd spend millions. If you deliver, and we've done this in Rwanda, £550 per adult individual or £1,000 per household, you discover very, very quickly that almost every roof gets fixed, everybody ends up with a latrine, the children get in school, the number of meals eaten a day goes up, health indicators go up, and the total cost of this will be £100,000 for the community because they're getting their own tin roofs. Their cousin is putting the roof on. They're working out how to buy their own cow. They're getting their own food. So it's just much more effective. It's much more efficient, but it also is much less patronising. In an age where we're worried about, patronising colonial aid, it's giving dignity to people. It's saying, you know more. We're trusting you to get on with it.
I think 3 of the pushbacks are: 1, it creates dependency. 2, people might waste it on temptation purchases. 3, it discourages people getting into work and we're having a long-term sustainable improvement. Presumably your view is the evidence shows that none of those 3 are actually the case.
So I'll come to Dr. Puri in a second, but if I run through the 3, on sustainability, increasing the evidence is driving us towards single large lump sum transfers instead of a sort of monthly dole payment. So $1,000 lump sum one time. And we are finding in comparison studies that actually that has more impact than giving the same amount of money stretched out over 5 or 10 years. Stretch the money out as small amounts over 5 or 10 years. People tend to be using it for consumption. Give it as a lump sum, people tend to be using it for an investment purpose. They're fixing their house, they're starting a small business. And then you find the savings and investments and the returns and the income will be higher in 3 years' time. On the question of people not working or wasting the money, it's not just that there's very little anecdotal evidence of it. The point about the randomized control trial is you can literally demonstrate the difference between the control group and the treatment group. You can just demonstrate there are more businesses, there's more savings, there's more income, there's more investment, there's more employment for the communities that receive cash than those that haven't. And the final problem is that giving in kind, which is the alternative, doesn't really solve those problems. You give somebody, a bag of wheat, or you give them a tin roof, they often simply sell it to get cash anyway, right? So it doesn't really get you around the problem. And whatever your anxieties are about dependency, misuse, apply just as much to providing them with things in kind. It's just much, much less efficient because they sell the bag of wheat or the tin roof for a fraction of the price you paid to get it to them.
Jay, did you want to?
Yeah, if I can just actually add to what Rory was saying. So cash, the evidence coming out from a lot of the RCTs that Rory is talking about, and also in systematic review. So you're putting a lot of RCTs together, and what you're seeing is that actually cash works also in conflict situations where markets have been decimated, but when you're giving cash, you're able to create a multiplier effect of 2:1. Yeah, so 1:2, I beg your pardon. So, which essentially means that for every $1, you're creating, a greater income of $2. Yeah, even in conflict and in disrupted areas where there are no markets initially, and that's been brought out quite strongly. I think the other thing to notice with cash also is that it leads to this idea. That it'll be wasted and temptation goods. Actually, the evidence doesn't bear that out at all. The RCTs have shown, and also in a lot of the impact assessments that we do at IFAD, we use the same methodology. So we look at comparison areas, and we look at where IFAD's going in, and we look at packages of interventions. Of course, we're looking also for other outcomes. So we're looking at not just the hunger outcomes, not just the food security outcomes, but we're also looking at poverty outcomes and market access outcomes, because they're a pathway to getting to better and higher welfare. And with the evidence, we're finding that it is possible to put in, for every dollar of investment that you're putting in, you're able to leverage not just with respect to co-financing, $5, but you're also able to get impacts of 20% increases in market access, in food security, in food insecurity experience indicator actually goes down by more than 10%, and this is measurable primarily because we are using these counterfactual based studies, right? So they are imitating randomized control trials, but we're going in with packages of interventions, and you can measure the change that is attributed to a lot of these interventions that are going in. And we don't see any evidence of wastage of the kind that you're talking about. The other part that I also want to support is this idea that one-time intervention with respect to cash actually leads to greater investment than sort of multiple. So this idea of multiple dosages, which is what it's called in RCTs, is it only leads to more livelihood expenditure, but not so much asset creation. I think the last point I want to make is really the clarion call for evidence. I think FCDO would do a whole good and would create a global good, really, if not just FCDO, but not just nudge itself, but also nudge the international community to really invest in better evidence. So how to implement these programs, what works, what should be the implementation structure, what are we doing on the ground, so what is the frequency that you can use to deliver a lot of these programs for hunger, for poverty. We need a lot more evidence in that space, and we don't have it. Thanks.
Dr. Puri, I'm just thinking, collating evidence tends to make consultants fat.
Yeah.
And what Rory's talking about is trusting people. Is that the main sort of dichotomy that we've got here?
The last part again, please.
So is there a way through? You're advocating evidence. I'm saying Rory's talking about trust. I don't know, I'm putting words in your mouth, Rory. So is there a middle ground on both of this? Because what I don't want is another consultation period, more evaluation, which is costing £500,000 and people are starving.
Well, respectfully, I think it's a false choice, primarily because if we want to do more of, SDG2 or any of the SDGs, we need $3.9 trillion on one side, but we need to also figure out what will work to get us to those SDGs. And in a lot of cases, especially with respect to hunger and food security, what's the first choice that you would make? If I were to ask you that question, what is the single most important thing that you should be doing? If you go to Rwanda or if you go to Kenya, the answer is completely different, right? And so you do need to know as to what will work. You do need to know what the magnitude of those changes is going to be. And I don't think, again, respectfully, Chair, it'll cost you $500,000. Actually, now we have GIS technology, and now we can use artificial intelligence. A lot of this can be done extremely cheaply. And if you do RCTs or if you do quasi-experimental evaluations, these can be done extremely cheaply.
That research isn't there now?
No. So cash transfers there is. Cash transfers, there is actually quite a bit. You can also say that, yes, cash transfers, their impacts go from 3 to 7 years, depending on what is the overall outcome that you're looking at. And I wouldn't actually advocate for more RCTs for cash transfers, but I would advocate for more RCTs as well as quasi-experimental evidence on looking at interventions that are going to create markets. So if you want to put out and catalyze a new market with respect to a green loan, and if you want to put out a 0% loan, and if you want to create a market for completely new spaces, I would definitely advocate for evidence there. And the other thing that I would advocate for is also thinking a lot more about how to combine cash with asset transfer, with livelihood training, with livestock, with financial inclusion, and with land security. There's a lot of evidence that's emerging that says that this works, and it works in the long term, and we have the methodologies today to try and test that, but it's not something that, that it's not a systematic or critical amount of evidence that we can use.
You've completely thrown me. Just thinking of the billions, if not trillions, that have been spent over decades and decades at that research isn't in place to justify all of that. So thank you very much, Virendra.
Thank you. Hi, Rory. Hi. Nice to see you back.
Nice to see you too.
The question to you. Does the SDO's current approach to food security programming empower people to make decisions about their futures?
So, unfortunately, there's a lot of good rhetoric around this. So the FCDO has a phrase in their international development programs saying that success is unleashing the potential of people to improve their own lives, right? So, but in practice, a lot of their programs are not really doing that. And one example of that is that they are still very reluctant to use large lump sum cash outside a particular humanitarian context. They want to control much more closely the choices that people make. Now that's partly something that will be comprehensible to everybody in the committee, because it's partly a political problem, right? There's partly a problem of selling to voters the idea that you might be giving cash. One of the interesting things, though, is if you think about welfare at home, right, we've moved away from thinking that the way to help people in the United Kingdom is to try to give them food vouchers, specify exactly, buy clothes for their children, etc. We give them cash, right? Because we know that it's very, very bureaucratic and wasteful and cumbersome for the government to try to guess with every family whether what you need is a new skirt for your daughter or a new food and what. So part of the thing that I want FCDO to understand is the genius of cash is it acknowledges that each individual in a village is different. Right? You might want to open a small business. I might want to put a roof on my house. You might have a aunt who's ill. You might be trying to get 2 kids into school. You might not have children at all. You might want to open a bakery. You may want to open a bicycle shop. You may want to invest in your cow. And instead of somebody going around with a clipboard, house to house, asking everybody what they want and then trying to get all those things for them, right? You save 90% of the cost by giving them the cash and letting them get on and make those decisions themselves. That's what they do with the cash. So I think the other thing to get across is that even if some people waste it, the amount of money they waste is tiny compared to the amount that the bureaucracies of big agencies and non-profits are able to waste in trying to micromanage the system. Yeah.
Dr. Puri, how do different development interventions, such as traditional agriculture programs and cash transfers, complement one another to work towards achieving SDGs2?
Thank you very much for that question. So I think I would sort of turn the question around a little bit and say that I don't think that we should go to every country in the world and say, well, we've got the formula for you. I'd sort of be a little bit more humble and say, well, cash is not the answer to everything. Because you do need, I think, individual level interventions Cash is a good example of that, but you also require sort of the more public, the more community level intervention. So, for example, the training, nudging the system in completely different ways so that you know that, yes, a lot of those investments will be, say, climate resilient, low emission. That's not going to happen by itself. And it is the role of, with the government systems in place to nudge these markets in a very different way. It is also important to think, for example, agroecological interventions. That's not going to happen by itself. It's really important for that nudging to occur from a more supranational or community-wide institution that sort of comes in and says, look, these are the incentives or the non-financial incentives that we can put in place. And again, we're getting a lot of good evidence on that. But I think the key in all of this is that the communities need to be taken together in a lot of this decision making. That's both got we know from, again, the RCTs out there, that when you bring together communities to make decisions, the same intervention is going to have a far greater level of satisfaction. Even if you're getting the same monetary outcome, the level of satisfaction is going to be far greater when you involve communities. So that's the localization agenda, but I do think that it needs to be far more intentional with respect to inclusion and participatory methods. So I think that you need to think of them as a package. I think the other thing that, again, I'm going to come back to this just for a very quick second, is really focusing on how do you create those institutions. So you've got the non-banking financial institutions. When you're looking at agri-food systems, a lot of these are informal systems, right? So it is the non-banking financial institutions that are coming in. They need to be nudged to go towards, say, the women, the vulnerable, those that don't have collateral. How do you nudge those? So you've got to bring all of them in as well. So while I think individual household level giving is important, institution building that needs to occur at the same time is supremely important as well.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you. Chris.
Thank you, Chair. Could either of you tell me straight yes, no, does the FCDO funded food security interventions reach the most vulnerable and marginalised communities? Quick answer.
Not enough.
Not enough. Would you agree? Okay, so Rory, a quick question to you to begin with then. How could it do in terms of reaching those communities? And then, Dr. Puri, maybe if you could let me know, how effectively does the FCDO recognise the relationship between climate vulnerability and gender in its programming?
On the plus side, FCDO has financed social safety net programs. You would have heard about the Benazir Bhutto Income Support Program in Pakistan, heard us about some of the programs in Kenya. And that's part of DFID's wheelhouse. DFID traditionally did a lot of work on extreme poverty. Where it's more complicated is some of the climate finance investment, so Green Climate Fund and things. Quite a lot of that money is pretty slow. Quite a lot of that money is going into middle-income countries, not to the extreme poor. As Dr. Puri was saying, we are now in a situation where we can be using AI, for example, on remote targeting, to be able to identify the extreme poor much more rapidly in the way that you were able in the past. And in Togo, for example, and this was something that became very obvious during the first stages of COVID, they used metadata from mobile phones for the urban poor who tend to own phones. And by looking at who they called and who the people they called and where the missed calls were and where they were located, they were able to get information on household poverty, which was equivalent to a 60-minute household survey, and were able to distribute electronically to 150,000 people, essentially in a few hours. Mm-hmm. And this is a program that would have taken traditional agencies many, many months to do. So there are some things that are changing, but I think that the fundamental question for FCDO is it prepared to put the question of the poorest, the most vulnerable and marginalised back in the very centre of the mission statement of the organisation? Or is it going to be endlessly tempted by sort of charming ex-diplomats to drift the money off to things that sound as though they might be development suitable, might be OECD suitable, but could be, frankly, looking after refugees from middle-income European countries in Britain who are not, they're in a lot of need, but they're not the poorest people in the world. They're not people living on under $2 a day. They're not people who frequently can't eat more than once a day, or perhaps even once every 2 days.
I think in terms of targeting, FCDO, but a whole lot of other institutions can do a whole lot better, and Rory speaks about this. Currently, we have, and again, I'm drawing on a lot of the research that comes from this space, but also from IFAD, we have what I call type 1 errors and type 2 errors. Type 1 error, you're not targeting people who really, really need, and these are the poor and the vulnerable that you're speaking about, right? And committing that is unforgivable, indefensible. A type 2 error, you're bringing in people who are relatively well off, and you're bringing them into your overall target area. I'm less worried about that. Yeah, because yes, you do have to try and see as to what is your cost effectiveness of how you deliver your intervention. The challenge is that most institutions don't spend sufficiently in figuring out how to target well, to reduce your type 1 error, because you do not want to leave out the poor, the vulnerable, the voiceless, the disempowered, right? And that's the indefensible part of, I think, what institutions forget to do, because they think, well, let's just spend money that's going to be sufficient and it'll make itself available to those who need it. We know trickle-down doesn't work. Thomas Piketty has said this, but a whole lot of others have also told us that. So I think that becomes really important. So targeting really well so that we are not committing our type 1 errors is really very important. The second part of your question is with respect to climate finance. Look, I do want to say FCDO has currently committed, it's committed to IFAD. IFAD has climate goals, for example, and we are committing to 45% of our overall investment being climate finance. It's also committed to additional climate contributions, which are going to be 100% climate. But I think there's a meta-level question here, which is what counts as climate? And it comes back to, I think, the point that Rory was making as well, which is I think we need to be, as an international community, far more credible on what we are calling climate finance. And there, frankly, there's a lot of washing that goes on, right? We know currently we are only just looking at, well, this gets tagged as climate, or either you're using what's called the Rio methodology or you're using what's called the MDB methodology. Both of these are very, very coarse, and they're only looking at what is going in as tagged as climate. But what you really want to see is what's happening on the ground, what's the outcome. And no institution actually takes it far enough. Even the current ESG reporting systems that we have, we actually don't get to see what is the overall improvement in climate resilience, or even just resilience that we are making.
To Puri, why?
Because we're not pushing them far enough. And we are very, and I'm going to hark back to the 1930s, actually. This is exactly that moment in time just before the Great Depression, when the entire commercial world was being told, oh no, we need to look at our assets and liabilities in the same way. We need to have a standardized system of understanding the health of our firms. We didn't do it. We got the Great Depression. That's when the world woke up, essentially, and said, okay, we need to have this double entry accounting system, and we had an entire cadre of chartered accountants essentially then created, even though it was considered too expensive in the late 1800s and then the early 1900s. That's exactly the point we're at now. We're at a point where we're essentially closing our eyes and saying, oh yeah, we are going to believe that yes, every dollar that's going in, because it's climate tagged, is probably going to make a big difference, but we don't know.
And I think, just to follow up on your question, Chair, there are part of the problem is that if something sounds like a nice thing on the surface, nobody is really incentivized to look very carefully at what the impact is, particularly when it comes to international development. Because, if you set up a huge fund for, healthcare in the United Kingdom, the people who are the recipients of the funds are your voters. Right, and your media is looking at it, and there's direct accountability, and there are taxpayers paying. Right? Push the money out to Somalia. None of those mechanisms are operating. Right, the Somalis who are receiving the money have no access really to the British media. They're not taxpayers, it's not their own money coming, there's no accountability mechanism, there's nobody they've elected. So if, frankly, they're looking at the programme, as I discovered again and again in Afghanistan, we spent $1.3 trillion in Afghanistan, $1.3 thousand billion, right? And Afghans consistently would say, basically, we're not seeing anything. This is rubbish, right? But there was very, very little incentive anywhere in the system to actually look at that seriously, measure it seriously. And I, again on cash, I one of the criticisms I sometimes get on cash is people say, but it causes envy between villages, right? If the next door village gets cash, all the other villages want to know why they didn't get it. Whereas if the next door village gets a traditional development program, the other villages don't care, right? Well, why do the other villages not care? It's because they don't actually believe that that development program is making much difference to that village, right?
Rory, you're a Secretary of State. What did you do to challenge this?
Not enough. Not remotely enough. Not remotely enough. And why not? Partly.
Like a group think that you were busy.
No. It wasn't that I was busy. It was partly because I couldn't work out how to sell cash. I really struggled. I thought
you think that cash is the answer, not accountability.
Well, accountability is part of the whole thing. I mean, if you were accountable to the community and you said to the community, would you rather get cash or would you rather a bunch of people from an international NGO turn up and do a training program for you? I mean, to put it in context, we have the same problem with, David will, experience this with his own constituents. I mean, if you say to a farmer in my constituency in the Lake District when I used to be an MP, would you rather somebody gave you, £45,000 cash which you can spend on your farm, or would you rather spend £45,000 on a consultant who's going to turn up and tell you how to farm? Right? They'd be pretty clear about what they wanted to do. Now, Dr. Puri is right. Cash isn't the answer to everything. There are other things you need to put around it. I mean, if you think again about agricultural policy in Britain, right? You can't just allow the farmers to do whatever they want. You have to have regulations in place. You have incentives in place. You want to encourage them to plant trees. You want them to make environmental and eco investments, and you design systems around that. But international development isn't like that. International development is a crazy world that doesn't exist in the developed world, where we are far, far more patronizing. We've got this thing in our head that what we've got to do is go around the world teaching everybody how to fish, when the reality is they already know how to fish, but they don't have the money for a fishing hook, or they don't want to fish, they want to open a bakery.
Or they need a fridge to put the fridge in.
Yeah, so they want a fridge, yeah.
So, but to labour this, but what you were saying, and you gave the example of Afghanistan, was it 1.3 trillion went in?
From the US, largely, US and its allies.
What you're implying is they went on the wrong projects.
Oh, it's absolutely staggering. I mean, there's wonderful stuff if you ever wanted. I mean, the Special Investigator General for Afghan Reconstruction has produced a document.
I'm leading you into your pet area, which I should know not to do.
Okay.
But when we're looking at nutrition and ending hunger, are you also saying that the money is being spent in the wrong place?
Often. I mean, the real question is, because there are so many people in extreme poverty, there are 770 million people who can't meet their basic needs. Maybe 440 million in Africa, up from 180 million in 1980. So you have to be really efficient with your money. We're never going to have enough money. So you have to make your money go as far as you can. And it's criminal to have a $600 million program of which only has $300 million of impact, because basically you could have helped twice the number of people. And a lot of our programs are of that nature. It's not quite that they're doing nothing, right? There are lots of well-meaning people, there's lots of stuff happening, but nobody is asking the really tough questions about, if I took that 600 million and spent it in a different way, which is why cash is a really good benchmark, would I not get a better outcome and help twice as many people?
And you're not saying that there's fraud within the system.
No, I think it's bureaucracy and well-meaning waste generally. I mean, it's look, I mean, in the end, nutrition programs are happening. Starving children are getting plumpy nuts. Food is being delivered, cash is being delivered. But we're very, very bad at, we can't even see the numbers often. I mean, if you were actually to take UNDP and really try to work out how much money goes in one end and what the outcome is at the other, you would find it impossible to do.
We have been trying, and yes, you are correct.
Yeah, because they don't even measure it like that. They don't know how to measure it like that. They will account for their staff on the ground as program cost. Right? They will say that part of their output is muddled up with the number of people they're employing. But really measuring these programs in the way that you would measure a medical trial is generally not happening.
Let me pause you there. Chris, did you want to come back? And I know Thea wants to come in.
No, I'm okay, but unless you had something like that.
Quick rejoinder to that.
Of course.
Actually, we do, IFAD does measure its outcomes and impact in exactly that way. So we do look at, well, what would have happened outside of, if IFAD hadn't been there, what's the counterfactual? And so all of the measurements that we have, for example, on resilience, improving resilience by more than 20% for more than 30 million people, we measure it and we say what would have happened to that resilience had IFAD investments not gone in. So we imitate RCTs, but we use what are called quasi-experimental methods on market access, agricultural productivity, overall income, resilience, nutrition, and women's empowerment.
Thank you. Theo.
Thank you, Chair. I just wanted to pick up, Rory, you mentioned that cash transfers you think is a very good way to get money to recipients, but obviously in certain countries technology is very challenging. We know in countries like Kenya, M-Pesa is a very good system which was originally funded by ODA. So how do you think the British government can get those money to recipients in countries which doesn't have the technological capabilities that somewhere like a Kenya would have? And secondly, I'm interested in refugee camp settings because I visited some of the camps in East Africa, and obviously they do have a large number of very, very small farms, but as I said, in a refugee camp that's even more challenging setting to get access to cash.
Yeah, I mean, there is a technological challenge. It is getting easier though. You can now buy a simple Nokia phone for $7, $8, and on that phone you can run your mobile money account. On that phone, you can get basic data about weather. You can sign up to an insurance policy. And because it's a very good mechanism for delivering social payments, better than moving cash, you can actually have quite a good cooperation with governments, even in a very poor place like Malawi. In Malawi, phone penetration probably running about 60% amongst the extreme poor. You could drive that up quite easily to 85%. You do need to build masts. You do need to have a market proposition which works for mobile phone companies. But in Liberia, for example, non-profit cooperating with the mobile phone provider has been able to build masts right out into the most remote areas and issue phones to people. So I think we're moving quickly into a world where that becomes more and more doable. And then there's a whole interesting question about data infrastructure, because once lots of people have phones, governments can do lots of things to help them, right? They can gather information on them, they can provide educational nudges, health nudges, agricultural nudges. I mean, and there's coordination issues too. I mean, again, where I agree with Dr. Puri, I mean, if you could coordinate the cash with other forms of intervention, it's often much more effective. So if you know that agricultural extension workers, in other words, the people who are training you and planting are going out to a community and you can get the cash to arrive at the same time, that's good, right? If you know that the government is building a road out to an area, right, or there are new market investments taking place, an irrigation program, an electrification program at the same time, again, the cash can go further. But the technology is much closer than it was 10 years ago to allowing us to do it. Not universally, because, I mean, obviously, again, not to put David on the spot, or maybe Chris on the spot, I mean, there are people placed in your constituency which may not yet have mobile phone coverage, but it's getting better.
Isn't the additional challenge as well access to bank accounts? Because we've heard evidence on previous committees that the very hardest to reach and most marginalised don't have access to bank accounts at all.
That's why mobile money in Africa has been transformatory, because effectively your SIM card is your bank account. Yeah. You no longer need a bank account. This obsession with bank accounts is not necessary if you're talking about people in remote areas of South Sudan. That you can receive the money on your SIM card, you can pay for things with your SIM card, you can get cash on your SIM card.
Thank you. David.
Hey, Dr. Puri, small-scale farmers
receive only about 1.7% of FCDO climate finance and only 6% of international climate finance targets towards nutrition objectives. Is small-scale farming receiving adequate attention and funding from the FCDO?
I think those numbers are quite eloquent by themselves. Actually, it's the number in terms of climate finance for small-scale farmers is less than 1%. So that number's changed from 1.7. So it used to be 1.7 of overall new and additional climate finance. Now it's 0.8%. And this is, again, indefensible primarily because small-scale farmers are producing 1/3 of the overall food that we all consume. So clearly, and the other part is that very few large commercial private sector entities actually invest there. 96% of all of the investment that you're seeing essentially in small-scale farmers is, and especially on increasing their resilience and with respect to climate, is essentially coming from public entities, right? So clearly that needs to be upped. I'm not saying that FCDO needs to be doing all of the investment, but I think what FCDO could be doing a lot more is to be creating exactly those platforms where you can have more risk-taking, more ability to build the kind of infrastructure that you're talking about, the digital infrastructure that is required, public infrastructure that is required on which apps can be built. Although I do want to say very quickly that, with digital, you do have to be a little bit concerned about the last mile, the poorest, the most vulnerable. Even now, as we look at the 600 to 700 million that are living in extreme poverty, 600 million, I think we do have to consider that they don't have access to the kind of technology or even broadband that we require for digital money. So it is important. Yes, if we can invest there, then the one-time investment there could be extremely useful to then create greater coverage. But in Uganda, we've seen this. RCT is also done in that context. They've also shown us. But I think coming back to climate finance becomes really important to see what is the kind of investment that needs to go in for small-scale farmers. And there, again, adaptation. I feel like a broken record, but I'm just going to say that. Adaptation resources are clearly important because we are going to be seeing a lot of agricultural production, for example, be affected. In East and Southern Africa, it's going to be 20 to 80% of overall agricultural being adversely affected. And unless we are ensuring that a lot of that adaptation resources are going to small-scale farmers, we'll see a lot of mortality.
And one of the great strengths, again, on my own broken record side of cash, is that it allows much more flexible adaptation. Right? I mean, it can actually allow a small farmer to decide to cease farming and open a bakery or set up a bicycle shop or a tailoring shop. You can diversify. It can allow people to move to cities, use the cash to actually move to the city away from the community. So and again, with resilience, it allows you to compensate if there's a climate disaster. It allows you to adapt very quickly to what it is that's been killed. Is it your livestock that's been killed? Is it your house that's been knocked down? Is it a relative that's been injured? So I think where we're coming to here is that Dr. Puri is making a very good case for the very incredible importance of the enabling environment, the regulations, the environmental policy, the nudges to try to make those agricultural investments more effective and more sustainable. But that doesn't mean that she's advocating, I don't think, for going back to a world of in-kind specialised contributions where you're going house to house saying, you need to plant watermelons, you need to put wheat in, you need to be growing coffee, and here's your coffee beans, and God forbid, with subsidising your fertiliser and all this kind of stuff, which is still happening. I mean, I want to know how money's wasted. There are many, many countries, sadly, in sub-Saharan Africa where colossal amounts of money, billions, is spent on subsidising inputs into agriculture, which do not benefit the extreme poor. Unfortunately, ends up subsidising.
Very grateful if you could write to us on any of that. It would be helpful.
Because the final point was really what would better align the FCDO's programming on food security, nutrition and sustainable agriculture? What?
Well, I mean, for my money, I'd like to see FCDO acknowledge where our strengths and weaknesses are as Britain, looking at another person's country. That there's lots of stuff we don't know about other people's country. Our staff's limited, our money's limited, so we really need to focus on where the evidence shows we can do best. And we also need to acknowledge that there are other players. So don't try to replicate what China's doing, don't try to replicate what the World Bank's doing. If those people are able to make the big loans to build roads, build dams, build infrastructure, that isn't necessarily what you want to be using cash grants from UK citizens to do, right? Focus on the things where we have evidence, where we think we can make a difference, and probably, I think, also limit the number of countries we intervene in, because we're never going to have enough money to spread ourselves thinly across the whole world.
Dr. Puri, you get last word. Do you want
Thank
to
you.
add
So,
to that?
while I'm advocating for this systems approach, thank you, Rory, for this systems approach where you're looking at cash, but you're also looking at other parts, legislation, but you're also looking at training and asset transfers. I think the one other thing that we haven't spoken about here are women. And really also understanding that, we've got a huge wage gap, especially in agri-food systems, and if we really want to do something that can really, get agri-food systems to really turn the corner and really think about getting us the kind of nutrition targets that we've set for ourselves. We found this in our research and our impact assessments as well. We didn't even target nutrition. We just targeted women because we wanted to see the empowerment indicators and the goals to be reached. And magically, not so, we got our nutrition goals as well, primarily because we were going through women and going through the overall empowerment pathway. I think that's really important. So my two big takeaways, 3, systems. Please think about systems and not just single interventions. It's really important, and thinking about communities being integrated into that decision making. 2nd, evidence. We've got to think more about how we are pushing the international system, FCDO, but also any other organization that is interested in international development to tell us how much of a difference they're making. We don't know that. And then 3rd, we've got to really focus on the poor, the marginalized, and separately, the women. Thanks.
That is a fantastic summary, appreciated. And both of you, thank you so much for your time. We really appreciate it. If we can just pause while we bring up the next panel, please, and invite in the next panel members. Thank you both so much. Thank you. You've given us loads.
The proceeding is currently suspended. 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 The proceeding is currently suspended.
Yes, I can. Hello, everyone.
I've got to say, I love your top. I'm going to covet it for the whole of the session. Thank you very much for joining us. If I can say to all of you, we will be directing questions.
The proceeding is currently suspended. The proceeding is currently suspended. The proceeding is currently suspended.
Second panel. If I could briefly ask each of you to introduce yourselves and tell us a bit about the organisation. Dr. Diana, could I start with you? Tell us who you are, who you work for, and what you do in this field around nutrition and ending hunger.
Sure. My name is Dr. Diana Onyango. I'm the head of technical team in Farm Africa. Farm Africa is a charity organization that's working in East Africa, specifically in Ethiopia, Uganda, Tanzania, Kenya, and we are also planning to start a program in DRC. We work under three main pillars, that's agriculture, markets, and environment. Basically, our work is centered around the vision of improving or increasing agriculture production in smallholder farmers in a sustainably managed environment, and also increasing access to markets for these farmers. So this touches on food security, increasing food security, improving nutrition outcomes at the household level, and also for the community. That's us in brief. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Ruchi, could I ask you to introduce yourselves?
Yeah, pleasure to be here. My name is Ruchi, and I lead VSO's global work on resilient livelihoods. VSO is an international volunteering for development organization working with some of the most marginalized communities around the world, really strengthening their agency and voice, as well as working on system strengthening. And we do this by placing volunteers within the system. We largely now work with community and national volunteers, and also international volunteers. We work on health, education, and livelihoods. So I lead the livelihoods work, which is focused on informal workers, women farmers, and really bringing the world of work and food systems together to strengthen the most marginalized.
Thank you very much, Ruchi. And finally, Dr. Rachael, could I ask you to introduce yourself?
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Committee. My name is Dr. Rachael McDonnell. I'm the Deputy Director General of the International Water Management Institute and the Senior Programme Director for Water Systems at the CGIAR, which is the consultative group on international agricultural research. So we are the research and innovation organisation that has the world's biggest publicly funded research network with 10,000 staff across the world, working through 15 research centres in nearly 80 countries, and importantly, with more than 3,000 partners. We work on many different disciplines, from genetics through to soil and on-farm practices and aquaculture, through to nutrition, diets, markets, as well as policies, and as you'll understand, political economy, which all impact our food systems. So we've been at the forefront of agriculture research and innovation for more than 50 years. And our innovations have been responsible for significant yield increases in most of those commodity crops that you're looking at, and in livestock and in fisheries. And our micronutrient biofortification of many crops such as sweet potatoes has really led to a nutritional input to millions. But we know the challenges facing our food systems now are multifaceted, very complex, as the white paper has said. And our mission these days shows that there is a need to move beyond agricultural production to much more systems thinking, as Dr. Puri was saying there. And so our mission these days is about science and innovation that advances the transformation of food, land and water systems in a climate crisis.
So, of our previous panel, you were listening and nodding, and I wonder what Dr. Puri was saying about the lack of evidence for what works. Is that something you recognise?
As a scientist, as a scientific organisation, our roles cover three main areas: gaining evidence, finding that evidence, testing solutions, testing ideas so that our farmers are not exposed to ideas that are not already well tested, and about policy. But that evidence is critical. That is how we stimulate policy changes, it's how we stimulate investments.
Exactly, which is why I'm asking the question. So with respect, do you recognise what she was saying about the lack of evidence on what works?
The world is changing. There is not enough evidence that captures today the conditions that our farmers, the farming communities are having to face. We hear about conflict, but it's about the extreme events from climate change are really changing the data that we rely on.
I'm going to try one more time. Is there enough evidence?
No.
Thank you. Nigel.
Thank you. Can I start with you, Dr. Diana? What challenges do agrarian communities in low-income countries face when it comes to climate change?
Okay, thank you. The challenges are many. There are direct challenges, of course, that are faced with the extreme weather events that are seen. In some situations, we have prolonged droughts because of failed rains, as we experienced from 2020 to 2023. We have floodings in some areas, and of course, all this directly impact on agriculture production. It can lead to loss of farmlands from the floods, or it can even lead to loss of livestock due to drought, lack of water, lack of pasture, or even in flooding situations, some livestock are washed away in those situations. There is also the challenge that they have in accessing markets. It may not be a direct challenge as a result of climate change, but it's an indirect challenge that comes about due to the poor productivity that they may be facing. They're not able to even meet the market demands for the different crop value chains that they're engaged in. The other challenge that farmers are having is lack of knowledge or inaccessibility to new knowledge, maybe if I may put it that way, because of lack of extension service delivery that may not be reaching the farmers, or they just are not able to access this knowledge, maybe lack of training, access or information that is not able to reach them, especially when we look at issues around climate information, market information, and also information around sustainable agriculture practices in the face of climate change. The other challenge that they have is lack of market infrastructure. This contributes to post-harvest losses. Farmers are not able to access storage facilities, poor infrastructure such as roads, or lack of markets also impacts on them negatively.
Thank you. That's very comprehensive. Dr. Rachael, could you maybe educate my ignorance on what is agroecology and how does that help address all those issues that Dr. Diana just raised for us?
We have seen many reports that come out that agri-food systems, our agriculture systems, is causing damage to our biodiversity and is contributing to climate greenhouse gas emissions. So agroecology, it's a way of thinking. It's sort of linked to regenerative landscapes and all of that. Is we know we need to still produce food, but we want to be able to produce food where we also look after the biodiversity. We also recycle, for example, manure systems, and the way we can reuse nature and parts of the agricultural system into still growing food. And we're doing quite a lot of trialling of this at the moment because we want to make sure that, yes, this is good for the environment, yes, it's good for climate. It's also a framework that's about making sure it's a locally framed way of working. But we also want to make sure that there isn't a drop-off in yield, there isn't an impact on incomes for farmers. So it's looking at and trialling in many different areas that we're looking at the moment to see if this can work.
So is that compatible with efforts to genetically change seeds so they resist certain blight and don't need the same insecticides? I mean, are those two things hand in hand, or are they competing with each other?
We can use them. So breeding has been a very important way that we have been able to increase yields. And what we need to do, it's not necessarily just the seeds that the new seeds that are the new species we're doing, but it's how we're managing them. So it's about, can we use natural pesticides? We don't have to necessarily bring in fertilizers that are based on NPK, hydrocarbons. We can use other forms of fertilizer for all of that. So it's a case of using our seeds, balancing the way we are doing our production, the way we manage our water, for example, the irrigation we're doing on that. Can we add more carbon manure from the farm? Can we put that into the soil so the soils hold more water? So it's that sort of balancing across without losing production and we're losing income and nutrition as well.
And Ruchi, just finally, do you think the UK is doing a good job on this? I mean, are we boosting this, or are we in a different field, really?
I think the UK can definitely support and jump on board and join the Agroecology Coalition, which many organizations are a part of, including the EU and us as VSO. We've developed this agroecology assessment framework, which really helps donors, governments, projects assess how agroecological their projects, their portfolio is, because agroecology is quite context specific. So it doesn't have a blueprint as such, right? You have principles. So it's really important to assess how closely we are advancing the principles of inclusion, of diversity, and just finally, just to add to the definition of agroecology, for us in the civil society movement, I mean, agroecology is really important. It's a science, as Rachael has said. It's a practice which millions are practicing right now. It's also a movement, because let's not forget that food systems and hunger is also a governance failure. So really placing those at the center, those who are facing hunger at the center, is absolutely essential when talking about agroecology.
Thank you. Andrew.
Hi. Ruchi, the International Development White Paper sets out several commitments on agriculture. How can the FCDO best fulfill these commitments?
Thank you. Yes, we're very pleased to see the white paper. And I guess I would say three things. One, let's look at all of the principles. So UK government's committed to aligning its aid and its spending with Paris. In the Women and Girls strategy, we talk about really focusing in and supporting women and girls. We have commitment to nutrition-sensitive agriculture, right? So, and hopefully, as Rory was saying, really a focus on extreme poverty. So if we can combine and not look at silos, really look at a holistic transformation of the food system with those principles. Secondly, look at, with a laser-sharp focus on who we're talking about. Who is the strategy, especially if we're looking at SDG2, who are we trying to address? Aren't they the people living with hunger, people living in poverty, informal workers, farmers? So the second is who and what, right? What are we trying to do? And the what for us is agroecology, which really addresses climate crisis, livelihoods crisis, food security, nutrition. So if we can focus on these, I think we'd be, doing a good job.
Dr. Diana, to what extent are these commitments going to contribute towards the SDGs2's targets?
Okay, thank you. Just to also add on to your previous question, I think the support that FCDO has provided has supported farmers mainly at the production level. Because through FCDO funding, especially focusing on experiences of Farm Africa and the projects that have been funded with by FCDO to Farm Africa, the focus has been on improving the agriculture practices by introducing and promoting climate-smart agriculture practices. But there is an opportunity there to also go beyond that, to go beyond agriculture production and to scale that up and look at the agri-food system as a whole. So also just to add on to the point about agroecology, we also have to consider the social, cultural issues around the communities that we are working with, the context around the traditional norms, the context around gender and social, gender, the gender balances around that. So that when we're designing programs and when you're looking at scaling up these programs, we need to take into consideration all this. The other consideration or the other scale up that we should look at in terms of looking at the food system as a whole is the biodiversity approach, going beyond the farms or agriculture and looking at the environment in which these communities are living in. So that gives us that creates an opportunity also for FCDO to look at supporting programs around sustainable land management, sustainable forest management, basically sustainable management of natural resources, because these are the environments that these communities are living in, that they are working in, and if we can go beyond supporting agriculture production and look at the environment. It will now build on food security and climate resilience in these communities.
Thank you.
Thank you. Chris.
Thank you, Chair. Despite the Ruchi, I'm about to speak to yourself there. Despite the SDG2 being set in 2015, shockingly, there's been no UK government international agricultural strategy in almost 20 years. So I really want to ask you, how important is it to have a strategy, and what should the key components be?
Thank you. I think it's about time to update the strategy. And I would say that we need to look at agriculture and food systems together. Lots has changed since the last strategy. Climate change is, there's a climate crisis right now. There's a hunger crisis. There's a livelihoods crisis. So we also know agriculture employs a large number of people. So the agriculture policy should take into account all of these multiple areas that that need to be addressed. So in terms of not just production or consumption, but employment, resilience efforts, as well as nutrition, and the impact on the most marginalized. Because I think, again, going back to hunger being a governance failure, really putting the agency and the voice of those affected by poverty and hunger at the center would be crucial.
Thank you. And Dr. Diana, how should SCDO update the conceptual framework on agriculture for 2024?
Okay, looking at the last conceptual framework, I think the focus was on scaling up or diversification. But just going back to my point, it was really more focused around agriculture, but now we need to look at the agri-food systems as a whole. So we need to look at what other areas or opportunities can we consider in terms of creating sustainable agriculture communities, agriculture-based communities. So it's beyond agriculture production. We look at other challenges that they are facing, issues around financial access, issues around market access, issues around access to information. So we can structure programs that are addressing these challenges. The other issue is around women and youth inclusion. Especially in African communities, the women and youth are disadvantaged because of the social-cultural norms. Again, they may not have access to the resources that they may need to make sure that they are in a productive agribusiness production system. So we need to look at how can we empower the women, how can we empower the youth to be able to actively engage in agribusinesses that is also sustainable, considering also the social cultural norms around it.
Thank you, Dr. Diana. And Dr. Rachael, is the government's climate policy putting sufficient focus on sustainable agricultural practices?
We know that we have no choice. It isn't a nice to have to be sustainable. The FAO's State of Agriculture and Food Systems report that came out at the end of last year highlighted the trillions of costs, the externalities that are not being included. So the loss of biodiversity, the pollution of water, all of those. These are not things that we can just brush under the carpet and just move on again. We have to be able to have agri-food systems, and it's possible to have agri-food systems and the production that we need if we can bring in these best practices. Often these were best practices that always used to be there, but now we know with the scale of production now, we need to be able to take on board what is the impact on greenhouse gas emissions, what are the impact on biodiversity, what are the impact of all those, and we can develop practices that reflect that.
Thank you. My last question to yourself, Dr. Diana. What interventions are most effective in helping farmers to adapt and become more resilient to climate change, which Rachel's just touched on? Okay,
maybe I'll just give them under an umbrella of this climate smart agriculture interventions. This looks at interventions such as promoting regenerative agricultural practices. These are practices that will allow the farmers to continue producing more in the face of climate change, because they'll be able to farm in situations where there is less water availability by using practices such as mulching. It uses less water, and they'll be able to get the yields they need by using inputs such as drought-tolerant seeds. When we look at pastoralist communities, promoting livestock breeds that are more drought-tolerant or survive better in drought situations, such as camels and goats, that will ensure that they'll become resilient in situations where there's prolonged dry season or drought situations. So basically, looking at such practices will ensure that the farmers are able to adapt to the challenges of climate change. Then there's also another opportunity here, looking at also research around new innovations or approaches that can be integrated into these systems. When you're, of course, bringing in research findings, we also have to consider the traditional knowledge that may exist in the community practices. How can we integrate this to make sure that we are able to come up with a practice or methodologies or approaches that is able to address their needs and that they're also able to buy into, rather than just feeding them information or feeding them with the knowledge in kind of a top-down approach that doesn't really address their needs. So participatory approach in coming up with solutions that are addressing the challenges is also essential in this situation. The other way that we can also support communities is access to now, as I mentioned, three main areas that is still a challenge is finance. I think in the previous panel we talked about finance and unbankable communities. They are not able to access credit facilities. So how can we get these facilities in a way or in a form that is accessible to the communities? M-Pesa is one of them, as it was mentioned before, is a way to channel funding to these communities. Access to information and extension services is still a big challenge in many communities in Africa. Farm Africa has piloted an extension service delivery called village-based advisors, where community members who are more knowledgeable than the others in particular areas are supported and are trained to provide these extension services to their fellow community members, and they are supported technically by the government service delivery agents. So that kind of like makes sure that there is a communication delivery channel from weather communication, market communication that trickles down to the communities. The other is linkages to markets. That's still a challenge. And that's where now we also need to bring in the private sector, because we have the private off-takers, importers, exporters. They need to be brought on board to also work with organizations such as Farm Africa and other charity organizations to link now the farmers to markets. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you. We've still got quite a few questions, but we're getting tight on time. So could I ask people to give us succinct answers, please? Over to David.
Yes, Dr. McDonnell, can I ask you, against the backdrop of rising food demands and predicted failing crop yields, what do you think is the role of scientific research in supporting food security?
The predictions are that because of climate change, yields are going to drop between 20 and 80%. So we need new types of crops that are at ease with the conditions, whether it's changing the length of a growing season or the availability of soil moisture or salinity. So it's very much about being able to test new and breed new crops, new practices on the farms, and new markets for that. So science has to be there, because our current systems will not be able to sustain the yields that are there at the moment.
What do you think, because it came up in the previous evidence session, what do you think farmers' approaches to these new types of crops are? Are they open to?
So as a research organisation, we actually reflect what Dr. Diana was saying. we work on demand. We are research for development. So we work with governments, we work with farmers. They are part of defining the research we do and then being part of the research and trialling. And then we work with small and medium enterprises about scaling up those findings. So that seed distribution, those things like that. So farmers are very much there. As Dr. Diana was highlighting, there is a need for knowledge. One of our ways that we've been able to spread the knowledge of some of those innovations in Zambia is through a reality TV show called Mundo Makeover, and it's 650,000 on a Sunday afternoon. Listen to what these on-farm practices of some of the technology, not only just our organisations but others are being able to do it. So it's about knowledge sharing, reaching those farmers and being able to show the evidence that yes, it does work in Zambia or in this particular context. It's that locally developed innovations that are going to be critical.
So that programme, you make over a farm in a sense?
It's like in the UK they do up a house in there, they do up a farm and they bring in those innovations and they show how they work. There's a similar one in Kenya, but this is the one that we, the CGIAR took our innovations, work with a TV company, and it's and you have a TV, but you have many people watching that TV. So we reckon it's about 2 million people. Right. We reckon.
And Dr. Diana, do you think that's the sort of approach to encourage people to change practices? And overall, what do you think farmers, communities are looking for from scientists?
Yeah, farmers actually would love to get research findings. There is a bit of a disconnect in some situations of trickling down of information from research and also packaging the information in a way that farmers understand. Because for farmers, what is their goal? They just want to increase their yield, increase their income. So if there's anything that can address these two issues, they will welcome it. But of course, they are also risk averse. They will not just jump on a new approach methodology, new seeds without seeing how does this work? What is the impact? What is the cost? Is there an additional cost pegged to this? And then still we go back again to knowledge and information around this. How do we use this? And what more do I need to know about taking on this new practice? So in such situations, what we have done is through those village-based advisors, we also use them as farm models. Basically, if there's anything new that we would like to introduce, we trial them out at these farms, and the farmers can compare their yields with the yields that are seen in the farm, in the model farms, which are also used as a training ground. And with this, then farmers are able to take on or to pick on these new approaches and methodologies.
And do you counter much resistance from people who just want to pursue traditional practices? I mean, in Scotland, we encounter people who often, say that things have always been done in a particular way, and they're not very open to doing it in a different way.
Yes, that happens. It still happens quite a bit in different farming practices. Fortunately, also there are farmers that take on the risks and are willing to try on new things. So we use them as examples of the changes or whatever practices that we are promoting to continue to educate farmers who are still stuck in their traditional ways. However, also with the change in the weather patterns, it really doesn't allow for much. It really doesn't allow for farmers to stick on the traditional ways, because that doesn't work anymore. They are not able to realize good yields from their agriculture production. They have to pick on new things. For example, using drought tolerant seeds, because like as I said, the last 3 years we had below average rains, so they had to take on seeds that are performing better in dry situations, in dry conditions. They have to take on new practices that maybe allow them to farm with less water availability. So the climate change is also kind of like driving them to change their practices.
And Ruchi, do you think there are any pitfalls to the use of new technology and research?
Depends on who controls them. So I think often when scientists will ask women, their choices are different. So it depends on what purpose the technology is. I mean, what solution, what problem the technology is trying to address, right? I think it's really important. And what we found is farmers learn best from each other. And best in their own conditions, so not in sort of model farms or lab conditions, really. So we've, through FCDO funded program in Zimbabwe, been supporting agroecology school in Mashingo, where farmers have come and really learned real life examples in terms of, and I think this mixture of indigenous knowledge and scientific knowledge and knowledge from elderly and young is so important to address the current crisis, right? So technology is not neutral. I think depends on what problem it's trying to solve and who controls it as well.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Dr. Diana.
Thank you. Richard, could I just do a follow-up on that? It concerns me that there's also a lot of money to be made in this field. And I'm thinking about in the UK 30 years ago, F1 seeds coming in and a lot of marketing around that. I'm thinking when Dr. Rachael was talking about fertiliser, there's a lot of money as well as a lot of emissions around that. So do you have any concerns that there are commercial interests in this field that could impact on the long-term sustainability for local people?
I think it really depends on what the purpose is. If we're trying to address hunger and food security, then we need to invest in people who are living with hunger, which is smallholder farmers and women, and we need to address the underlying barriers that they face. If we're trying to look at growth, then sure, we can really invest in large businesses, agribusiness, in companies. So it depends on the purpose. And I think that's, so for us, for VSO, again, with FCDO funded programming, we've been working with Suro Trust in Zimbabwe, which has been saving indigenous seeds. And really that it has set up a seed bank, because once farmers lose control of their seeds, then you are dependent on the market. And you also lose the indigenous knowledge. So definitely, I think there are pitfalls that we need to address.
Yeah. Thank you, Chair. Ruchi, if I could ask you as well, what extent do you think the FCDO's agricultural programming does support nutritional outcomes?
I think FCDO has been a champion around nutrition for a little while. What I would say is that let's look at nutrition holistically, because you have direct nutrition interventions, nutrition-sensitive agriculture, which for us would be agroecology, because you need diverse seeds for diverse diets, and which are in the hands of farmers, rather than looking at only nutrition-sensitive approaches, right? So the holistic approach is really important. For us, we've been also setting up agroecological, kitchen gardens in schools. So we've integrated that as part of our education, again, FCDO-funded education programs in several countries, because that understanding of nutrition and eating diverse diets is so important. And that's why I go back to seeds. If you lose diverse seeds, then you lose the opportunity of having diverse diets. I mean, our diets are becoming ultra-processed. We're dependent on just a few handful of crops globally. So for me, the nutrition debate has to be opened up. And again, FCDO is a champion in this area, but really come back and look at agroecology and nutrition in the whole, including investing in women's empowerment.
Thank you. And Rachael, if I could ask you, to what extent do you think the FCDO and other government departments are consciously aligning food security policy to work together? Or not?
Well, as an organisation that works, we talked about systems right at the very beginning, and you can't look at the food system by itself because there's a climate system and the water system and the environment system, and of course the energy system. We haven't really mentioned the energy system, and building a dam to generate hydroelectric power can influence irrigation and aquatic food systems downstream. So what we see is the FCDO is a great supporter of the CGIAR. They're the third biggest funder. So that's been important, and they have really catalysed a number of the innovations that I've been speaking about today. But can we think more broadly as a system and link in the funding on water and on energy and environment? I think there's ways that we could do that. We are delighted to work with UK research institutions, and we are beginning to do that as well with a new amount of fund. And we think there's an awful lot of overlap that we can bring in terms of our understanding of the global south, linking to global north innovation and the ability to do that. So there is some new thinking, I think, that's needed for if we're going to really address the big problem for SDG2.
Thank you.
Sorry, Theo. Do you see FCDO filling that gap and leading on that thinking?
It can be part of the catalyst, as Dr. Diana was talking about, was, there is investors out there that we work. I remember one of the memories from last year was going to an investor forum in Zambia. There was a lot of money available to invest in agricultural systems where we have already shown that these new technologies, the ideas are going to work. So we see FCDO working with us on blended finance, on ways of scaling through, because FCDO or USAID or whoever's investment is not going to get us anywhere near where we need to go. But if we can have tested solutions that then can be taken out through the agricultural extension agencies and other areas like that, we see that as a critical role.
Thank you for you. Thank you. And Diana, could I ask you, what do you think the impact has been on the ODA cuts on smallholder farmers, but particularly women?
Actually, I have first-hand experience on that because I was managing a Farm Africa project that had to end early, 1 year earlier than we had intended. It was a 4-year project as a result of the cuts. And in that particular project, we were looking at supporting pastoralist women to recover from drought through a goat distribution initiative, which also had a strong component on nutrition, household nutrition, and nutrition for children under 5. Fortunately, because some of the activities around changing nutritional, hygiene behavior and improving household nutrition, most of those activities were done early in the year. We had a very good impacts and outcomes on those. However, one of the things we had integrated in the project was development of enterprises, business enterprises around goat rearing, and that is what suffered the most because we had already created the foundation to support these communities to improve on their nutritional outcomes. However, we're not able to finish up with now the sustainability aspect, the businesses and the enterprises that will continue supporting them to continue to sustain on this aspect. So of course this has had a long-term effect on the nutritional outcomes of the communities that we were supporting. Unfortunately, these are pastoralist communities, so of course they suffered other challenges after the project duration, which continue to impact them negatively. So based on that experience, we can see that the cuts did have an impact on these communities that were being supported by those projects in terms of the impact on the food security, nutritional outcomes, as well as the enterprises that were being supported through this the implementation activities that are going on in the ground.
Thank you. And just finally, Diana, how do you think the FCDO... Sorry, Ruchi, if you could answer if the FCDO is ensuring its programme design is leaving opportunities for women's voices to be heard.
I think we're really pleased with the Women and Girls strategy. Now the time is for it to really run through, and particularly in the area of food security and hunger, where we see women as being the most impacted, but women are the farmers, they are the holders of indigenous knowledge, of seeds, of so much promise. So we would love to see how the Women and Girls strategy and the food systems or agriculture strategy come together to strengthen women's own agency, their voice, their access and control over their incomes, resources, and as you know, as soon as you work with women, women farmers, we have to really invest in their capacity and in addressing the underlying barriers they face, be that violence, be that their unpaid care and domestic burden. So again, really integrating SRHR, economic justice programming, is what we're looking towards.
Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much. Is there anything any of you would like to add?
Maybe just, perhaps just a small point on also ensuring, food security and livelihoods being really important for ensuring peace. So some of our programming in fragile context, including in post-conflict Mindanao in Philippines, where we've done a small investment in agroecology, and that's bringing the community together. That's keeping the peace. That's also changed the image. These are ex-combatant camps. It's changed the image of the camp as well. So again, not to forget the peace dividends. Thank you,
Richard.
Dr. McDonnell, you mentioned that you are starting to cooperate with some UK research institutions. Which ones?
I have them here. So, the John Innes Centre, University...
I hope you would say that, because it's in my constituency.
Well, I did wonder. I did put it first. I did have
I was going to point out that they're probably Europe's leading plant and nutrition science research institution, but you are cooperating with John Innes already.
Scotland Rural College, London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine and University of Leeds. But we have, we are talking about... These are some early stage areas, and we're now going to be working with other ones as we expand this programme.
Thank you. Witnesses, thank you so much for your time. We now have loads to start chewing away at and seeing what we can come up with. If you do have additional thoughts, either after this session or as we go forward, that you could put into written evidence for us, that would be very welcome. Thank you for all you're doing in this field. It is deeply, deeply appreciated. And I would like to end the session. Order. This session is now closed. Thank you very much.
The proceeding has ended. 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 The proceeding has ended.